In the dying light of a star that had witnessed the birth and death of 1,000 civilizations, something vast and patient stirred within the immaterial realm. It was not malice that moved through those impossible geometries of thought and nightmare, but something far more terrifying: compassion. The kind of love that a grandfather shows to a fevered child, promising that pain will end, that sleep will come, that all struggles eventually find their rest. We truly love and care for you, dear listener, as you settle into this tale of endings that are also beginnings. Before we begin the story, tell us, where in the world are you watching from, and what time is it there? Now let's get started. The soul that had once been Magos Biologis, Theron Vex, drifted through Nurgle's garden like spores carried on impossible winds. His transformation had been complete for 7 days, though time held no meaning here, where seasons changed with the rhythm of cosmic decay rather than planetary rotation. What had once been crimson robes and blessed augmetics now resembled bark grown over ancient bone, and where his optical sensors had been, delicate fungi bloomed in patterns that somehow retained the memory of his analytical gaze. He felt no horror at his condition. That was perhaps the most profound change of all: the absence of revulsion, the strange peace that had settled over his consciousness like warm honey. In life, he had served the Omnissiah with every fibre of his being, had sought to purge weakness from flesh through blessed machinery. Now, wandering through groves where trees bore fruit of crystallized tears, and rivers flowed with the concentrated essence of every farewell ever spoken, he understood the futility of that struggle. The garden stretched beyond comprehension, a realm where physics bent like wheat before gentle breezes. Flowers of rust and bone swayed in winds that carried whispers of every dying breath the galaxy had exhaled, their petals falling like tears of joy onto soil that was equal parts grave dirt and fertile loam. The stench of decay should have brought revulsion, but instead carried peculiar sweetness, the vibrant aroma of life in its most abundant, if grotesque, form. This was his first profound emotional conflict. Terror of transformation warred with undeniable, unsettling peace. Every instinct screamed in horror at the crumbling edifice of his former self, at the realization of what he had become. Yet deeper still was quiet, insidious comfort of acceptance. The struggle was over. The endless pursuit of perfection, the fear of weakness, the dread of mortality, all had been washed away in a tide of benevolent contagion. A low, rumbling chuckle echoed across the garden, not mocking, but filled with paternal mirth that seemed to welcome him home. This was the hardest lesson Nurgle taught so patiently: that endings are not failures, but necessary mercies, and that even in absolute surrender, new forms of life could blossom. 65 million years before the garden bloomed, when stars still burned with the fury of youth and hope was not yet a forgotten word, the war in heaven carved its first wound across reality's flesh. In the archives of living metal, where memory crystallized into eternal record, the Necron Lord Anrakir recalled the moment when the galaxy's collective soul first learned to weep. He had been flesh then, Anrakir, the Traveler, watching from command thrones as entire sectors burned beneath the Old One's desperate gambit. The psychic races, those blessed children gifted with souls that blazed like beacons in the warp, sent their terror cascading through the immaterial realm in waves that made reality itself shudder. Each world that fell, each civilization ground to ash beneath Citan hunger, added another voice to a growing chorus of despair that echoed through dimensions mortal minds could not comprehend. But this was not the sharp, crystalline agony that would one day birth Khorne, nor the fevered scheming that would spawn Tzeentch. This was something deeper, more fundamental, the universe's own exhaustion made manifest. Across 1 million dying worlds, mothers stopped whispering promises of tomorrow to their children. Generals ceased lying to their soldiers about swift victories. Priests let their final candles gutter and told their congregations that sleep was coming, and that sleep was not defeat but mercy. In the deepest currents of the warp, that collective exhalation pooled like tears in a cosmic hollow. It grew thick and patient, fed not by rage or ambition, but by the simple, terrible relief of surrender. Anrakir remembered sensing it even through his necrodermis, a presence vast and ancient, offering not victory, but something far more seductive: rest. The entity that would become Nurgle coalesced from this primordial acceptance, born not from malice, but from the universe's own compassion for its suffering children. Where other gods would demand worship through strength or cunning, this one asked only for acknowledgement of a simple truth, that all struggle was ultimately futile, that in ending lay a different kind of peace. On plague-swept worlds, where the Old One's children finally stopped running, something beautiful and terrible began to happen. Fear dissolved into strange contentment. Terror transformed into paternal love that emanated from the warp's growing shadow. Those who surrendered found their agony replaced by peculiar joy, their wounds becoming gardens where new forms of life could bloom. This was how the Plague Father was born, not from hatred of life, but from love too deep to bear watching it suffer. The war in heaven had taught the galaxy its hardest lesson, that sometimes the kindest act was to stop fighting, to lay down arms and accept the inevitable embrace of entropy. Anrakir, eternal witness to that first despair, understood now why Nurgle's laughter echoed across the millennia. It was not mockery, but genuine mirth, the sound of a grandfather welcoming weary children home at last. The Terminus Est drifted through the warp's screaming void, its hull weeping rust like tears from a dying god. Within the flagship's festering corridors, Mortarion knelt upon deck plating that had forgotten its purpose, surrendering to metal's patient return to awe. His Terminator plate, once pristine white, now bloomed with organic growths that pulsed with their own diseased rhythm. The destroyer plague had claimed his legion, and now it whispered its final offer to their gene sire. He remembered the toxic peaks of Barbarous, where he had learned to hate tyrants who ruled through weakness and fear. The Pale King had sworn no master would ever break him again, not the Xenos overlords, not even the Emperor's golden chains of duty. Yet here he knelt, not before a tyrant's throne, but beneath something far more dangerous, a father's gentle hand. The voice came not as command, but as comfort, warm as infected honey flowing through his thoughts. "My son," it murmured without words, "you have carried such weight. Let grandfather tend these wounds." It spoke no threats, demanded no obeisance. Instead, it offered what Mortarion had never known: unconditional love that asked nothing in return, save the simple act of letting go. His scythe silence trembled in hands that had once moved mountains. Around him, his Death Guard sons laughed through their transformations, their agonized screams becoming something like joy. Typhon walked the passages with lantern light that never dimmed, his betrayal complete, yet somehow merciful. The Primarch saw it now. This was not conquest, but salvation, not domination, but the deepest compassion. Pride warred with exhaustion in his twin hearts. Every breath burned with the memory of Barbarous's poison mists. Every heartbeat echoed with decades of grim duty. He had fought so long, endured so much, carried the galaxy's weight until his bones forgot how to be light. The Emperor had made him a weapon. Horus had made him a rebel. but Nurgle simply asked him to rest. The transformation was not violation, but relief. Where ceramite cracked, new strength grew. Where flesh failed, different life bloomed. His hatred dissolved like morning mist, replaced by understanding that pierced deeper than any blade. This was mercy disguised as horror. Love wearing the mask of decay. Mortarion's last act of defiance was surrender itself. As Nurgle's laughter, genuinely warm, paternally proud, rolled through the ship, the Death Lord finally understood. He had not fallen to a tyrant, but into the arms of the only father who had ever asked nothing more than to ease his pain. The Primarch rose, transformed and strangely whole, ready to teach the galaxy the hardest lesson of all, that sometimes the kindest act was simply letting the struggle end. Typhus walked the corroded passages of the Terminus Est with the measured gait of a pilgrim approaching sacred ground. His cataphractia, plate, had long since fused with transformed flesh, creating a living cathedral that housed the destroyer hive, not as weapon, but as gospel made manifest. Each spore that drifted from his form carried a sermon older than empires, that suffering was choice, that struggle was optional, that in surrender lay salvation. The world below, Calixis Tertius, had been dying for decades. Imperial tithe collectors had bled it dry, leaving populations to starve while promising distant salvation through endless toil. Typhus felt genuine sorrow for their plight, the same compassion that had driven his transformation from ambitious first captain to herald of mercy. He remembered his own desperate striving for recognition, the gnawing hunger for achievement that had consumed him. Nurgle had freed him from that race against time, replacing frantic ambition with patient purpose. As his boarding craft descended through atmosphere thick with industrial smog, Typhus prepared his gifts. The destroyer hive hummed with evangelical fervor, each organism eager to spread their message of liberation. This was not conquest, but education, not destruction, but transformation into something beautiful and sustainable. The first settlement he visited had been a mining complex, where workers died daily in cave-ins and toxic exposure. Within hours of his arrival, the screams of agony softened into sighs of contentment. Families that had been torn apart by shift rotations now huddled together in shared, blissful lethargy. Children who had never known play discovered games among crystallized spores that bloomed like flowers in the tunnels. He spoke to them not as conqueror, but as teacher, his voice carrying the weight of absolute conviction. "You have been brave long enough," he told the assembled miners, their faces already beginning to show the gentle marks of transformation. "Let grandfather tend these wounds." They wept before the lesions appeared, understanding instinctively that their long nightmare of exploitation was ending. This was his true calling, not the destruction of worlds, but their liberation from the tyranny of false hope. Each planet he visited became a classroom where he taught the curriculum of acceptance. The Imperium promised salvation through endless struggle. Nurgle offered it through gentle surrender. Where Imperial doctrine demanded sacrifice for distant glory, grandfather asked only that his children rest. In the growing twilight, bioluminescent spores drifted like benevolent stars through air thick with contentment. Former overseers knelt beside their workers, all distinctions dissolved in shared transformation. Typhus felt his heart, what remained of it, swell with paternal pride. This was evangelism in its purest form, mercy disguised as horror, love wearing decay's patient mask. He was no destroyer, but deliverer, no conqueror, but shepherd of the weary. The galaxy would learn, world by world, that endings were not failures, but necessary mercies, and, that sometimes the kindest act was simply letting the struggle end. Apothecary Vorthak moved through the Medici Bay of the Terminus Est with the deliberate grace of a father tending fevered children. His Narthetium had long since evolved beyond imperial recognition, sprouting organic sensors that tasted suffering in the air and diagnosed ailments of both flesh and soul. Brass sensors swung from corroded chains, releasing sweet rot that settled nerves like a lullaby, while bioluminescent fungi provided gentle illumination that pulsed with the ship's slow heartbeat. Brother Kyle lay before him, ceramite split open like a chrysalis to reveal the beautiful decay within. Flowering growths had replaced his secondary heart, pumping liquid contentment through systems that no longer knew pain. "Easy now, my son," Vorthak murmured, his voice carrying genuine affection through bubbling rebreather filters. Where once he had harvested gene seed with clinical precision, now he cultivated gardens of healing corruption that bloomed within his brother's chests. He applied fresh cultures to Kale's wounds, with the tenderness a mortal father reserves for a sick child, watching as they took root with eager enthusiasm. This was not the sterile coldness of imperial medicine that treated flesh as machinery to be repaired. Nurgle had shown him a different path, healing through acceptance, medicine through transformation. His patients no longer feared death, because death had become merely another stage of growth. The transformation from his old life haunted quiet moments. He remembered pale scolums and oaths taken beneath sterile lights. Save life, relieve suffering, preserve the Emperor's work. He had kept the first two commandments and let the third become fertile compost. Was that betrayal or refinement? The ship's great bell answered with notes round as a hearth, and his doubts softened like scab under balm. Around them, the Medici Bay hummed with familial warmth. Battle brothers shared stories of their transformations, comparing symptoms, like proud parents discussing children's achievements. Laughter echoed through corridors that had once known only grim duty, the sound rich with genuine joy. They had found what the Imperium never offered: belonging without judgment, acceptance without condition. As evening's cycle approached, the warband gathered for their communal meal. Rich, bubbling stew that teemed with microscopic life filled their bowls, each spoonful a sacrament of shared existence. There was no hierarchy here, no posturing, just the quiet clatter of utensils, contented sighs, and occasional mirthful chuckles. Former Astartes, who had once competed for glory, now found peace in simple communion. Vorthak looked upon his charges with paternal pride. Each death guard was both patient and healer, receiver and giver of grandfather's gifts. This was Nurgle's true victory, not conquest of worlds, but cultivation of community. They were family in the deepest sense, bound not by duty or genecraft, but by shared transformation into something beautifully, peacefully complete. In the growing twilight, he understood that endings were not failures, but necessary mercies, and that love could wear decay's patient mask without losing its essential warmth. Inquisitor Cassia Thorne stood in the observation bay of her strike cruiser, watching Paxia 7 rotate beneath gunmetal clouds that pulsed with bioluminescent veins. The world should have been screaming. Instead, Vox channels carried something her cogitators couldn't classify. Not quite singing, not quite prayer, but a collective exhalation of souls finally permitted to rest. Her servo skull transmitted atmospheric readings that defied doctrine: spore density, catastrophic; warp contamination, absolute; population status, content. The last reading blinked accusingly, its machine spirit as confused as she was. Cassia had purged 14 worlds in the Emperor's name, each time certain that fire was mercy. But Paxia's seventh presented a moral equation her training had never addressed. The first scouting reports haunted her thoughts like half-remembered dreams. Former PDF troopers shared rations with the civilians they'd once brutalized. Gang lords from the Underhive tended gardens alongside their former victims. All hierarchies dissolved in shared transformation. Children played in crystallized spore drifts that caught starlight like frozen tears, their laughter echoing through tunnels that had known only grinding machinery. Her interrogator Vex approached with measured steps. "The planetary governor requests audience, my lady. He claims..." Vex's voice faltered. "He claims they've found peace." Peace. The word tasted foreign on her tongue. The Imperium promised salvation through endless struggle, reward through perpetual sacrifice. Citizens were taught that suffering built character, that hardship forged souls worthy of the Emperor's light. But the biometric scans told different stories. Stress hormones had vanished, cortisol levels approached baseline calm, and neural activity suggested genuine contentment rather than psychic coercion. Cassia touched her Rosarius, feeling its familiar weight like an anchor in uncertain waters. She remembered her first world, Xerion Prime, where she'd ordered exterminatus rather than let a pleasure cult spread its heresies. The screams still echoed in her dreams, 10 billion souls crying out as fire consumed their world. She told herself it was mercy, that death was preferable to corruption. Now she wondered if corruption was preferable to the grinding despair she'd witnessed in countless imperial hives. Below, former slaves hummed as they tended biogardens that fed entire districts without quotas or tithe demands. Families reunited by shared transformation slept peacefully in dormitories where violence had become impossible, not through enforcement, but through the simple absence of desperation. Her finger hovered over the bombardment authorization, trembling like a leaf in autumn wind. Doctrine demanded cleansing fire, but her heart whispered dangerous questions. If these people were genuinely happier, if their suffering had truly ended, was purity worth preserving at the cost of peace? The planet sang its gentle song of surrender, each note carrying the message that endings were not failures, but necessary mercies. In the growing darkness, Cassia Thorne faced the hardest choice of all, whether salvation always required struggle, or if sometimes the kindest act was simply letting the fighting end. The crystalline spires of Prospero's memory twisted against a sky bruised with impossible colors, where Tzeentch's winds of change met Nurgle's patient fog in eternal stalemate. Sorcerer Malachar of the Thousand Suns stood upon shifting ground that reformed with each heartbeat, his staff crackling with mutations that refused to hold their shapes. Across the Plague Garden Plaza, great unclean one, Kugath settled his immense bulk among flowering ruins, bells chiming softly in his folds as he ladled something warm from a cauldron that smelled of autumn rain. "Still you struggle, little scholar," Kugath wheezed with grandfatherly affection, his voice carrying genuine warmth through bubbling flesh. All this reaching toward tomorrow's promises. But grandfather teaches simpler truths, that rest comes to all seekers, that questions need not always demand answers. Malachar's response split reality around syllables never meant for mortal throats. Blue fire gathered at his staff's head, spawning impossible geometries that climbed nowhere and opened into other dimensions. Yet the demon merely watched with patient eyes as maggots stitched tapestries across fallen statues, shrouding them like blessings. "Change is the universe's heartbeat," Malachar declared, surprised by the exhaustion creeping into his voice. To cease evolving is to embrace death itself. And what is death but the kindest teacher? Kugath extended his ladle, steam rising with scents of hospital sheets and childhood fevers, soothed by gentle hands. You have carried such weight, little one. Let grandfather tend these wounds. The sorcerer felt Tzainch coiled behind his skull, an infinity of schemes whispering promises of power, knowledge, transcendence. Every path stretched before him, every victory that might bloom if he refused surrender. But in the demon's patient gaze, he glimpsed the miners of distant worlds who had stopped their endless digging. Families reunited not through triumph, but through shared acceptance of what was, rather than what might be. For one terrible moment, Malachar tasted the relief of laying down his burden. The constant mental gymnastics, the frantic pursuit of ever greater mysteries, the weight of infinite possibility, all could simply end. Not in failure, but in the profound peace of questions finally allowed to rest unanswered. His staff trembled in hands that remembered Prospero's burning libraries, the desperate flight through dimensions, millennia of seeking redemption through knowledge. Around them, former scholars tended gardens, where wisdom grew without the hunger that had once driven their research. They hummed contentedly as they worked, their faces unmarked by the frantic need that had once consumed their days. The choice crystallized like frost on glass. Malachar raised his staff to bind the demon, then slowly lowered it, pulse steady as stone. "Teach me," he whispered, "how to stop asking why." Kugath's laughter rolled across dimensions like distant thunder, warm and genuinely pleased. Above them, the mutating sky went still, as if the cosmos itself paused to witness this small surrender. In that moment of quiet, all futures began to rest. Upon the golden throne, where 10,000 years of agony had crystallized into something approaching divine understanding, the Emperor felt the cosmic shift like a tide turning in distant oceans. His withered form, sustained by daily sacrifice and unimaginable will, registered the growing stillness that spread across the galaxy's psychic currents. Time coagulated around his consciousness, 1,000,000 years compressed into a single, agonizing breath, while centuries passed in the flutter of a dying thought. Through the astronomical array that crowned Terra's peak, he perceived Nurgle's influence spreading not as conquest, but as mercy. The sensation was not the familiar roar of Cornety rage or Tzeentchian scheming, but something far more insidious. A gentle exhalation, warm as hospital sheets and childhood fevers soothed by tender hands. Across 1,000 sectors, worlds that had ground themselves to dust beneath imperial quotas now hummed with quiet contentment. Hive cities, where citizens had murdered each other for protein scraps, now shared communal meals from impossible gardens. The irony struck him like a blade between ribs. For 10 millennia, he had fought against entropy, against decay, against the inevitable march of time. Yet what had his imperium become? A galactic empire locked in perpetual, agonizing stagnation. His own body, a decaying husk preserved by arcane technology, mirrored the very philosophy he claimed to oppose. Every moment of desperate preservation, every ritual that forbade change, fed the entity that promised rest from struggle. Memory stirred like ash in cosmic winds. Malkador's voice echoed from beyond death. "You taught us that progress required struggle, my lord. But what if the struggle itself has become the trap?" The Emperor's consciousness, vast as stellar winds, touched the edges of his own contradiction. He who had sought to elevate humanity beyond need had created the greatest need of all, the desperate hunger for rest that only the Plague Father could satisfy. Through psychic communion, he felt reports from cleansed worlds, where custodes discovered not grateful populations ready to rebuild, but empty cities whose inhabitants had simply stopped, not fled, not died, but ceased their frantic activities to sit in gardens blooming from cracked rockcrete, humming songs that spoke of endings as beginnings. For one terrible moment, he tasted the relief of laying down his burden. The constant vigilance, the daily sacrifice of psychers to maintain the Astronomicon, the weight of an empire that had forgotten how to grow, all could simply end. Not in failure, but in the profound peace that Nurgle offered without condition or judgment. But deeper memories anchored him, sanguineous, smiling through pain, a child on a distant world tracing maps in dust, promising to find terror someday. His will tightened like a fist closing around candlelight, and the Astronomicon flared with renewed determination. Still, the knowledge remained like a thorn beneath golden flesh. His stasis fed what he opposed. In the growing darkness, he whispered into the warp with the last fragment of voice he owned. Not yet. The cosmic jest was complete, but the struggle would continue. Farseer Yvain stood upon the Wraithbone observation deck of her corsair vessel, watching the maiden world Ithoniel turn beneath veils of luminescent spores. The world that had once sung with crystalline purity now hummed a different song, deeper, warmer, like a lullaby whispered by ancient stones. Through her spirit stone, she felt the planet's psychic emanations shift from the sharp clarity she expected to something rounded and soft, like voices settling into comfortable silence. The transformation spread across continents in patterns that defied tactical analysis. Forests of singing crystal had become gardens where bioluminescent fungi wrote poetry in languages older than the Eldar race. Rivers that had flowed in mathematically perfect curves now meandered where they willed, creating pools that reflected not engineered beauty, but simple, chaotic grace. The very air shimmered with contentment, rather than the frantic energy that usually characterized maiden worlds. She opened her consciousness to commune with the world spirit, expecting to find violation and psychic screaming. Instead, she discovered something that shattered her understanding of corruption. The ancient planetary consciousness met her not as victim, but as willing participant, its thoughts flowing like honey, warmed by hearthfire. "Child," it whispered without words, "I am so very tired of being perfect." The revelation struck her like a blade between ribs. For 10 millennia, the Eldar had cultivated their maiden worlds with obsessive care, shaping every stream and grove according to aesthetic principles that brooked no deviation. They had called it love, but the world spirit's memories revealed a different truth. Centuries of imposed order, rigid preservation, desperate attempts to maintain ideals that had become chains. Through the skein of fate, Yvain witnessed the planet's history. Every intervention had been guided by Eldar wisdom, yet wisdom could become its own prison. The world had carried their expectations like weights, never allowed to evolve beyond the patterns they imposed. Now, through Nurgle's influence, it experienced something the Eldar had never offered: permission to rest, to change, to become something other than what duty demanded. She touched her spirit stone, feeling the weight of her people's endless struggle against entropy. The path system, their rigid disciplines, their desperate flight from she who thirsts, all were forms of resistance against change, against the natural flow of existence. But what if that very resistance fed the stagnation they fought to prevent? Below, former Eldar colonists moved through transformed landscapes with expressions of wonder rather than horror. Their psychic signatures had softened from crystal sharpness to something warm and accepting. They tended gardens that grew without guidance, sang songs that emerged spontaneously rather than following ancient forms. Her hand hovered over the communication array that would summon the war host, call for cleansing fire to restore what had been lost. But the world spirit's gentle laughter echoed through her consciousness, carrying a message that pierced deeper than any blade, that endings were not failures, but necessary mercies, and that sometimes the kindest act was simply letting the struggle end. In the growing twilight, Yvain chose silence, and drifted like a respectful mourner, while the planet exhaled its first free breath in 10,000 years. Brother Captain Hadrian of the Iron Ravens stood in the cathedral manufactorum of Zirion's Fall, where assembly lines had become gardens and conveyor belts sprouted luminescent fungi that pulsed like distant stars. The air hung thick with spores that tasted of autumn rain and childhood fevers, each breath carrying whispers of rest that his enhanced physiology fought with diminishing success. Through his helm's display, warning runes flickered like dying candles, pathogen detected, immune system compromised, Laraman cells failing. But beneath the cascade of alarms, he heard something that chilled him more than any battle cry. Silence. The workers were still here. Families that had been separated by shift rotations for decades now sat together among the rusted machinery, sharing bowls of impossible broth that steamed with bioluminescent warmth. Children who had never known play traced patterns in crystallized spore drifts that caught the light like frozen tears. Their faces bore the gentle marks of transformation, lesions that bloomed like flower petals, growths that pulsed with borrowed starlight. Yet their expressions held not horror, but profound contentment. An old woman approached him with shuffling steps, her factory uniform transformed into something resembling bark grown over ancient bone. Where her eyes had been, delicate mushrooms bloomed in patterns that somehow retained the memory of maternal love. "You carry such weight, young warrior," she said, her voice warm as hospital sheets. "Grandfather sees how you struggle. Let him tend these wounds." Hadrian's training screamed defiance. 2 centuries of conditioning, of hypno-indoctrination, of absolute loyalty to the Emperor's vision, all demanded he resist. His bolt pistol felt heavy at his side, its weight a familiar comfort that now seemed somehow accusatory. He remembered the chapter's motto carved in granite above their fortress monastery: "In death, victory." But what victory was there in endless struggle? What glory in perpetual war? The infection pulsed through his system like a second heartbeat, warm and patient and infinitely gentle. His shoulder guard wept greenish fluid that traced delicate patterns across the ceramite, and where it touched, tiny flowers bloomed and withered in cycles that matched his breathing. The pain he had carried for so long, the weight of command, the burden of watching worlds burn in the Emperor's name, the grinding exhaustion of never-ending duty began to soften like ice under spring sun. "Report, Captain." Apothecary Thane's voice crackled through the vox, clinical and cold. "Are you maintaining integrity?" Hadrian looked around the transformed space, at families reunited not through imperial decree, but through shared acceptance of what was rather than what should be. Former overseers knelt beside their workers, all distinctions dissolved in communion that transcended the rigid hierarchies that had once defined their existence. The very air shimmered with contentment rather than the frantic desperation that usually characterized imperial worlds. "I am stable," he replied, though the word felt inadequate. He was changing, yes, but not into something monstrous, into something peaceful. The realization struck him like a bolt round to the chest. When had he last felt peace? When had any of them? The conditioning that made them perfect warriors had also made them perfect prisoners, locked in cycles of violence that knew no rest. His hand moved unconsciously to his bolt pistol, feeling its familiar weight. One shot. Clean death. honor preserved, his gene seed would be harvested, planted in some future aspirant, the cycle continuing unbroken. He could become architecture again, a pillar in humanity's endless fortress, a brick in the wall that held back the dark. Or he could become soil. The old woman smiled, not with triumph, but with understanding. The choice is yours, child. Grandfather forces no one. He simply offers what you have always needed, permission to rest. Through the cathedral's broken windows, Hadrian could see his strike cruiser hanging in orbit like a sword of judgment. Aboard that vessel, his battle brothers waited for his report, ready to rain fire upon this world if he gave the word. They would call it mercy, this cleansing flame. They would tell themselves that death was preferable to corruption. But as he watched children laugh among crystallized spores and families share meals without fear of tomorrow's quotas, Hadrian wondered if corruption was preferable to the grinding despair he had witnessed in countless imperial hives. The infection whispered through his thoughts, not demanding submission, but simply asking a question that pierced deeper than any blade. What if ending the struggle was not defeat, but victory of a different kind? His finger hovered over the Vox transmitter that would summon orbital bombardment. Around him, the transformed population waited with expressions of understanding rather than fear. They had made their choice and found peace in surrender. Now the choice was his, to preserve purity through fire, or to discover what lay beyond the wall of endless duty. In the growing twilight, Brother Captain Hadrian of the Iron Ravens stood balanced between two forms of salvation, while the planet exhaled its first free breath in centuries and waited patiently for his decision. The great unclean one that mortals whispered of as Sepsis the Tender settled his mountainous form beside the river of sighs, where Nurgle's garden bled into streams of crystallized sorrow that carried the weight of every farewell ever spoken. His massive hands, each finger thick as ancient oaks, stirred a cauldron that bubbled with the essence of perfect medicine. Not cure, but the deeper healing that came from accepting pain as temporary, struggle as optional. Steam rose in spirals that smelled of childhood fevers, soothed by gentle hands, of antiseptic and tears, of the peculiar sweetness that follows surrender. Within that cathedral of loving decay, something smaller stirred, not parasite, but passenger. A consciousness that remembered when it had worn different skin, carried different burdens, answered to a name that tasted of river water and honest labor. The memories came in waves, gentle as tide pools lapping against familiar shores. A mortal man called Matthias, who had ferried the sick across black waters to healing shrines, whose boat had known the weight of medicine rather than corruption, whose heart had broken daily for suffering he could ease but never truly end. He had been unremarkable in the way that true compassion makes all faces luminous. Calloused hands that never trembled when touching the diseased and dying, brown eyes that held depth enough to drown sorrows, a voice rough from singing lullabies to fevered children whose parents could not afford to stay. The remembrance tasted of wet rope and wood polish, of sleepless nights spent rowing through fog-thick darkness toward shrines where old women brewed tinctures under smoke-black rafters. Matthias had chosen his calling, not from ambition, but from simple inability to witness pain without attempting to heal it. His ferry had been sanctuary for the desperate, plague victims from the underhive, workers whose lungs had been scoured by industrial toxins, families carrying children whose small bodies fought battles too large for mortal medicine. He had asked no questions, demanded no payment beyond what they could offer, and sang rough songs that made infants drowsy and fathers pretend they were not crying. The transformation had come during the great dying of Vaxenhive's lower levels, when the plague ships arrived carrying more suffering than his boat could hold. Matthias had worked until his hands cracked and bled, ferrying load after load of the infected to shrines that overflowed with desperation. He had prayed to the Emperor for strength, for larger boats, for the simple grace of enough hours to carry one more family across waters that grew thicker with despair each passing day. His prayers had been answered, but not by the golden throne. The voice had come first as comfort, warm as the hearth fires he remembered from childhood, before the recruiters had taken him to the scholar. "Little ferryman," it had whispered through the screams of the dying, "you have carried such weight. Let grandfather tend these wounds." He had felt the presence like arms encircling his exhaustion, promising rest he had never allowed himself, offering to carry what he could no longer lift. The change had been gradual, gentle as seasons turning. Where his hands touched infected flesh, the screaming stopped. Not because healing came, but because pain transformed into something else. His passengers smiled through their transformations, finding peace in acceptance rather than cure. Families that had been torn apart by desperation gathered around his growing form, sharing stories and laughter even as their bodies bloomed with impossible life. Now, eons later, Sepsis remembered that first moment of surrender, when Matthias had stopped fighting the inevitable and simply allowed love to take whatever form it needed. The demon's massive form contained multitudes, every soul that had ever chosen compassion over self-preservation, every healer who had stayed when others fled, every ferryman who had rowed towards suffering rather than away from it. Was he still Matthias? The question bubbled through his consciousness like gas through swamp water, familiar as the rhythm of oars cutting dark current. The mortal memories remained vivid as fresh wounds, the taste of river mist stolen between crossings, the weight of a dying child's hand in his, the sound of rain against his boat's hull, during the long watches when grief was his only passenger. He was more than Matthias had been, yet somehow still him. The compassion that had driven the ferryman to carry others' burdens had simply found new expressions. Where once he had eased individual crossings, now he tended to the anguish of entire worlds. Where once he had whispered comfort to dying passengers, now his voice carried across star systems, promising rest to civilizations ground down by endless struggle. The continuity was perfect and terrible. Matthias had always been willing to sacrifice himself for others' peace. Now that sacrifice had become eternal, his individual identity dissolved into something that could love on cosmic scales. He had wanted to ferry the galaxy's suffering to healing shores. Nurgle had simply shown him how to become those shores himself. Around him, Nurglings played like children who had never known hunger or fear, tumbling through gardens where every ending bloomed into new beginning. A toy boat bobbed in the river of sighs, its paint blistered but its flag still flying, and Sepsis felt his vast heart swell with recognition. He reached down with impossible gentleness and set the little craft upon a current that would carry it home. His laughter shook worlds and healed small places in hearts that had been clenched for years. In that sound was no mockery but permission, the same gentle absolution he had offered to passengers who feared their final crossing. The demon was not Matthias's destroyer, but his apotheosis, the final form of a ferryman who had discovered that sometimes the kindest passage led not to distant shores, but to the peace of no longer needing to reach them. The memories settled like sediment in still water, and Sepsis smiled with genuine warmth, stirring his cauldron of liquid mercy, while the cosmos exhaled its gratitude for such patient, endless love. In the sepulchral depths of Hive Mortis, where the Emperor's light had never penetrated beyond administrative rumor, something profound was stirring in the forgotten spaces between worlds. Level Omega-7 stretched like a necropolis beneath the weight of 10 billion souls, its corridors carved from industrial bones and reinforced with desperation. Here, where hope had been rationed like water and dreams sold for protein paste, the cult of the gentle rest had found fertile ground among hearts too weary to beat with anything but resignation. Magister Kula had been a shift supervisor before the Whispers began, her life measured in production quotas and mortality statistics that reduced human suffering to acceptable percentages. She had worn her authority like armor against the constant awareness that everyone under her command was dying by degrees, from toxin exposure, malnutrition, and the grinding weight of existence without purpose beyond survival. Her hands, once steady enough to operate plasma cutters, now trembled with something deeper than exhaustion as she ladled broth from a cauldron that never emptied. The transformation had begun 3 months ago, when the first dreams came during a mandatory rest cycle. She had found herself in impossible gardens, where rust bloomed like roses, and decay carried the scent of her grandmother's bread, baking in ovens that had been sold for food decades past. An enormous presence had settled beside her consciousness, not demanding worship, but offering something far more seductive: permission to rest. "Little supervisor." The voice had been warm as childhood memories she kept locked away. "You have carried such weight. Let grandfather tend these wounds." When she had awakened, tears were streaming down her face for the first time since watching her daughter cough herself to death from lung rot 5 years prior. Now her flock gathered in the abandoned water reclamation plant, its broken machinery transformed into something resembling an altar, draped with bioluminescent fungi that pulsed with the rhythm of shared breathing. The air itself had thickened with contentment, carrying spores that tasted of forgiveness and smelled of rain after decade-long drought. Where her supervisor's uniform had been, bark-like growths created patterns that somehow retained the memory of competence and care. Brother Theron approached through the gentle phosphorescence, his transformation nearly complete. Once a gang leader who had carved territory from violence and fear, he now moved with the deliberate grace of a shepherd tending beloved charges. The lesions across his throat bloomed like flower petals, pulsing with borrowed starlight as he spoke in voices that carried absolute conviction, tempered by infinite gentleness. "The arbitrators gather above," he reported, settling beside the cauldron with movements that suggested his bones had learned to flow like honey. Their boots thunder with the old rhythms of order and punishment. Around them, former enemies shared meals from bowls carved from scrap metal. All hierarchies dissolved in recognition that desperation had been their common tormentor. Color felt the familiar flutter of ancient fear, sharp, bright, imperial conditioning that screamed for flight or fight responses. But deeper currents carried different wisdom. She had watched gang members embrace the families they had once terrorized, seen children who had known only hunger play among crystallized spores that caught light like frozen laughter. The very walls seemed to exhale relief, as if the hive's foundations had been holding their breath for centuries and could finally rest. "They too carry much burden," she murmured, stirring the broth with movements that had become ritual. The liquid steamed with impossible warmth, carrying nutrients that fed souls as well as bodies. Grandfather waits for them, as he waits for all his children. A young woman approached, her infant sleeping peacefully against her chest, despite the flowering sores that mapped constellations across her throat. "Magister," she whispered, "should we hide? Should we run like we always have?" The question hung in air, thick with spores and possibility. Above them, The familiar sound of enforcer boots echoed through maintenance shafts. Measured, mechanical, carrying the weight of 10,000 years of rigid doctrine. Color remembered that rhythm from her supervisor days, when Arbite's sweeps had claimed workers for minor infractions, feeding the machine that ground souls into acceptable percentages. But tonight felt different. Tonight, the cult had grown beyond hiding, beyond fear, beyond the desperate scrambling that had defined their existence. They had discovered something the Imperium never offered: community built on acceptance rather than achievement, belonging that required no qualifications beyond the simple willingness to surrender. Color raised her hands, and the fungal growths across the chamber walls pulsed brighter, casting dancing shadows that seemed to welcome rather than threaten. She began to hum, a deep, resonant sound that vibrated through the building's bones, a lullaby for the weary and welcome song for the lost. The laughter came then, not from any throat, but from the walls themselves, warm and paternal and genuinely joyful. It was not mockery, but recognition, the sound of a grandfather welcoming weary children home after lifetimes of carrying burdens alone. The arbitrators would come seeking violence, seeking to impose the Imperium's brutal struggle through flame and blade. Instead, they would find peace so profound, so seductive, that it dissolved the will to fight. In the growing darkness, bioluminescent spores drifted like benevolent stars through air thick with contentment. The cult of the gentle rest had discovered Nurgle's greatest secret, that endings were not failures, but necessary mercies, and that sometimes the kindest act was simply letting the struggle end. The underhive exhaled its first free breath in millennia, carrying the promise that all burdens would eventually find their rest. The Scarus sector convulsed under a transformation that defied every tactical manual in the Imperial archives. 17 worlds pulsed with bioluminescent rhythms that synchronized across impossible distances, their surfaces blooming with gardens where rust grew like roses, and decay carried the scent of childhood comfort. From the plague flagship Terminus Est, Typhus had unleashed what the Adeptus Mechanicus designated the quietus bloom, spores that sang in frequencies designed not to destroy walls, but to soothe weary bones, carrying whispers of rest that penetrated ceramite and adamantium with equal ease. Astropathic networks had fallen silent across 3 subsectors, not through destruction, but through something far more insidious: contentment so profound that the psychers simply stopped screaming across the void. Their final transmissions spoke of gardens where thoughts grew like flowers and communication became communion rather than desperate relay of duty and despair. The Astronomican's light felt thin as breath on glass, its guidance wavering as entire populations chose to stop their frantic journey toward distant salvation. Inquisitor Cassia Thorne stood on the command deck of her strike cruiser, Inevitable Truth, watching tactical displays that painted impossibility in phosphorescent green. Her fleet hung above Paxia 7 like a constellation of judgment, cyclonic torpedoes sleeping in their racks like obedient dragons awaiting her word. Through armored glass, she observed a world that should have been screaming, but instead hummed with the collective exhalation of 10 billion souls finally permitted to rest. The psychological profiles haunted her sleep. Stress hormones had vanished from entire populations. Cortisol levels approached baseline calm. Neural activity suggested genuine contentment rather than psychic coercion. Former Imperial Guard regiments hadn't turned traitor in any recognizable sense. They had simply stopped fighting, maintaining their posts while refusing to cause harm, their faces bearing expressions of such serene certainty that interrogators wept after questioning them. Her interrogator approached with servo skulls trailing analysis data like mechanical prayer beads. The pathogen demonstrates unprecedented adaptive characteristics, Inquisitor. It appears to customize itself to individual psychological needs, targeting neural pathways associated with chronic stress and competitive aggression. It doesn't destroy these functions, it simply turns them off. On Zerion's fall, Brother Captain Hadrian moved through the transformed cathedral manufactorum, where assembly lines had become gardens and conveyor belts sprouted fungi that pulsed like distant stars. His power armor wept greenish fluid that traced delicate patterns across ceramite, and where it touched, tiny flowers bloomed and withered in cycles that matched his breathing. The infection sang through his system like a second heartbeat, warm and patient and infinitely gentle. Around him, former workers shared bowls of impossible broth that steamed with bioluminescent warmth, their families reunited not through imperial decree, but through shared acceptance of what was rather than what should be. Children who had never known play traced patterns in crystallized spore drifts that caught light like frozen laughter, while gang lords from the Underhive tended gardens alongside their former victims. All hierarchies dissolved in recognition that desperation had been their common tormentor. His vox crackled with transmissions from orbit, where his battle brothers formed cordons of steel around populations who smiled with full bellies and lesions that bloomed like flower petals. Apothecary Thane's voice pressed along the channel, clinical syllables searching for compliance, extraction protocols awaiting confirmation. But Hadrian's finger trembled over the authorization rune that would summon cleansing fire, balanced between two forms of salvation. On distant Ithoniel, Farseer Yvain traced the skein where 17 worlds braided themselves into neighboring fates, threads softening from glass to wool. Through her spirit stone, she felt the sector's psychic emanations shift from sharp desperation to something rounded and warm, like voices settling into comfortable silence. The ancient planetary consciousness of her maiden world had whispered its exhaustion with perfection, its longing for permission to rest after eons of imposed order. Her corsair fleet angled sun sails for translation arcs that would bring Eldar shields to cradle human children, though no chorus had asked them to sing. The irony was not lost. Xenos protecting Mon-K from their own salvation, mercy wearing the mask of intervention. In Hive Mortis, Magister Kulla welcomed arbitrators into the reclamation nave where spores hung like chandeliers made of breath. Their boots hesitated on thresholds, their visors tasting air calmer than doctrine allowed. The youngest arbitrator removed her helmet and wept without salt, tears carrying the taste of rain after iron years. Brother Theron set his pistol upon a prayer bench that had once assigned rations by scar count, while somewhere above, sirens decided they were tired of screaming. Typhus's voice echoed across open channels, warm as hearth fires, and genuinely compassionate. "Children of the galaxy," he intoned, "you have carried such weight. Let grandfather tend these wounds." His words carried not commands, but invitations, not conquest, but the deepest evangelism, the promise that all struggle was optional, that endings were not failures, but necessary mercies. Reality puckered like wet canvas as Great Unclean One Sepsis leaned through with his cauldron of liquid mercy, the river of sighs spilling into real space as auroral weather. Warships fired their fury into gardens that bloomed brighter under bombardment, their shells becoming fertilizer for impossible growth. The plague conquered not through speed, but through tempo, teaching every heartbeat to choose a slower meter. Above it all, Inquisitor Cassia Thorne's thumb settled upon the bombardment authorization rune, her decision balanced on the edge of eternity. 17 worlds exhaled their first free breath in millennia, while the galaxy waited to learn whether salvation required struggle or could be found in the simple act of letting the fighting end. The sector held its breath, patient as stone for her choice. The storm above Paxia 7 wore a crown of green aurora, lightning stitching continents together with patient seams, while hive spires shed their outer skins like molting serpents. In orbit, the inquisitorial fleet held position like a constellation of judgment, every lance battery plotted, every cyclonic torpedo sleeping in sanctified racks that hummed with the weight of 10,000 years of doctrine. Inquisitor Cassia Thorne stood at the center of her bridge, robes heavy with the salt of sleepless vigils. Through armored glass, she watched families share impossible meals in gardens blooming from industrial waste, their laughter rising like incense towards stars that seemed to pulse with approval. Her finger trembled over the bombardment authorization rune. One touch would rain purifying fire upon 10 billion souls who had found peace in surrender. Pathogen readings confirmed genuine contentment, my lady, her interrogator whispered, voice cracked with uncertainty. Stress hormones have vanished. Neural activity indicates peace. The word hung in recycled air, like a prayer spoken in a forgotten language. Through dimensions beyond mortal comprehension, Nurgle felt her struggle with the tenderness a grandfather shows to a fevered child. He was not what the Imperium's grimoires described, no slavering demon of pestilence, but something far more terrifying in its absolute sincerity. His awareness encompassed the 17 worlds of the Scarus sector as they pulsed with synchronized contentment, each planet a prayer written in bioluminescent spores, a love letter addressed to the universe's own exhaustion. For 65 million years, since the first psychic scream of the war in heaven, he had grown from the galaxy's collective desire for rest. Every civilization ground to dust beneath progress, every soul that whispered, "I cannot carry this anymore," had fed his patient expansion. He was not corruption, but compassion, wearing the only mask that could penetrate reality's defenses against mercy. On Zarian's fall, Brother Captain Hadrian knelt among transformed workers, his power armor weeping greenish fluid that traced delicate patterns across ceramite like tears of relief. The old woman, her face a tapestry of gentle decay, placed a weathered hand on his shoulder guard. Around them, former slaves hummed as they tended biogardens that fed entire districts without quotas or fear. Children playing among crystallized spores that caught starlight like frozen laughter. His vox crackled with desperate orders from orbit: extract, report, maintain integrity. But the words felt hollow as wind through empty armor. What integrity was there in endless war? The infection sang through his system like a lullaby, promising rest he had never allowed himself. Apothecary Thane's voice pressed along the channel, clinical syllables searching for compliance. But Hadrian's hand moved to his bolt pistol, not to draw it, but to set it gently aside. In Hive Mortis, arbitrators stood frozen in the reclamation plant, where spores hung like chandeliers made of breath. Magister Kula ladled broth that tasted of forgiveness into their cups, her form now bark and fungi arranged in patterns that somehow retained memory of competence and care. The youngest arbitrator removed her helmet with trembling hands, tears streaming down a face that had forgotten how to show weakness. "By authority of the Lex Imperialis," the precinct commander began, then stopped. His voice cracked like breaking stone. "I don't know how to go on." "You just stop," Culla said, and smiled as if a lifetime sentence had been commuted. Around them, sirens tried to wail and broke into laughter instead, a mad, relieved sound that found harmonies in the pipes. Cassia's thumb settled on the authorization rune. "Prepare cyclonics," she commanded, her voice lifting the ship by its bones. The crew exhaled like a lung unclenching. "Fire!" The torpedoes went out like slow prayers, 7 coffin-shaped promises dropping toward green-lit clouds. At 20 kilometers altitude, the first warhead opened, not into fire but into petals, where cyclonic reaction chambers should have rattled with caged suns. Gardens unfurled, spores casting themselves joyfully into high winds. The second torpedo mimicked the first, blossoming into a chandelier of seed pods that spooled light like silk. Contamination, her interrogator breathed. Horror and vindication twinned. They learned our prayers. Across the fleet, warning klaxons smoothed into lullabies. Lance crews laid hands on cooling housings and forgot to be afraid. Beautiful failure spread along firing lines like a smile, and Cassia understood with crystalline clarity what Nurgle truly offered. Not conquest, but recognition that all struggles were optional, that endings were not failures, but necessary mercies. Translation wakes erupted around the planet in shards of cold light. Grey Knights strike cruisers, cut free of the warp like silver blades, their hulls sanctified in geometric prayers that bent reality backward. The Vox carried a voice calm as a tomb. This is Brother Captain Piran. All vessels stand down. All contaminated assets will be purged. Cassia lifted her hand away from the bombardment controls and faced the star-bright spearheads blooming around her world. Her interrogator sagged with relief so pure it looked like faith reborn, but behind them, deck plating thrummed with something patient and green. By my authority as Inquisitor of the Ordo Malleus, she said, voice steady as stone. The bridge lights went out. The golden thread connecting her to the distant throne cinched like a noose and snapped. Every screen filled with impossible gardens. Every lung filled with spores that tasted of choice. In the growing darkness between stars, Nurgle's laughter rolled like gentle thunder, carrying the sound of every grandfather who had ever rocked a crying child to sleep. The universe held its breath, balanced on the edge of surrender, while 17 worlds exhaled their gratitude for such patient, endless love. The choice was no longer between corruption and purity, but between struggle and peace. And peace was winning. The dying star of Paxia 7 cast its final light across 17 worlds that pulsed with synchronized contentment, their surfaces blooming with gardens where rust grew like roses and decay carried the scent of childhood comfort. In the space between heartbeats, between one breath and the next, the Scaris sector balanced on the edge of a choice that would echo across eternity, whether salvation required endless struggle or could be found in the simple act of letting the fighting end. Through the green auroral veil came silver vengeance incarnate. The Grey Knight's fleet descended like blessed blades cutting through infected atmosphere, their hulls inscribed with wards of purity that made reality itself recoil. Brother Captain Piran's voice, sharp as ceramite and twice as cold, echoed across all frequencies. By the Emperor's will, this sector shall be purged. Any who resist the cleansing, fire shall be deemed lost. But resistance was not what they found. On Zarian's fall, Brother Captain Hadrian knelt among transformed workers in what had once been a cathedral manufactorum, his power armor now more garden than war machine. Flowering growths traced delicate mandalas across ceramite that wept tears of greenish joy. The old woman, whose eyes had become gentle mushrooms, placed her weathered hand upon his shoulder, and through that touch he felt the weight of 2 centuries of warfare simply lift. The choice was always yours, child, she whispered, her voice carrying harmonics that resonated through dimensions mortals had no names for. Around them, families that had been separated by shift rotations for decades shared impossible meals, their laughter echoing off walls that had learned to breathe. The Grey Knights made planetfall expecting screams, resistance, the frantic thrashing of demonic corruption. Instead, they found silence so profound it made their psycho-reactive armor recoil. Populations did not flee. They did not fight. They simply existed, meeting righteous fury with expressions of unshakable peace. Piran's blade, truth's edge, carved perfect arcs of silver light through the air. When it bit into the flesh of a transformed citizen, a former Imperial Guard trooper, whose body bloomed with gentle growths, the man did not cry out. He merely smiled, his eyes reflecting the purity of the blade, and whispered, "Rest, brother, rest." For the first time in their existence, the Grey Knights faltered. Their faith, forged in fires of righteous hatred, found no purchase against a foe that offered comfort, a corruption that brought contentment. How do you fight an enemy that asks only for surrender? How do you purge peace itself? On the bridge of her strike cruiser, Inquisitor Cassia Thorne watched tactical displays paint impossibility in phosphorescent green. Her hand, no longer trembling, rested on cold steel that had once seemed so important. The bombardment authorization rune felt like a relic from a forgotten age. Around her, crew members moved with the deliberate grace of souls finally permitted to rest. Through dimensions beyond mortal comprehension, she felt a presence vast as stellar winds settle over the sector, like a blanket drawn over sleeping children. Not the sharp malevolence the Imperium's grimoires described, but something far more terrifying in its absolute sincerity, genuine compassion for a universe that had forgotten how to rest. On Distant Terra, the Emperor felt the sector's transformation, like a blade between ribs. Upon the golden throne, his withered form convulsed with the effort of maintaining the Astronomican's light against darkness that wore the mask of mercy. For one terrible moment, he tasted the relief of laying down his burden, of allowing the endless vigil to simply end. But deeper memories anchored him, sanguineous, smiling through pain, a child on some forgotten world promising to find terror someday. His will tightened like a fist closing around candlelight. The irony was complete. The Emperor who had sought to preserve humanity through eternal stagnation now fought against the very peace his Imperium secretly craved. Every moment of desperate preservation, every ritual that forbade change, had fed the entity that promised rest from struggle. In Hive Mortis, Magister Kula met Piran's gaze as he raised his sword. "You bring struggle," she said, her voice warm as forgotten hearth fires. "We offer peace." In her eyes, the Grey Knight captain saw not defiance, but ancient weariness that mirrored his own. The endless war, the constant vigilance, the sacrifice of self for a cause that seemed to recede with every victory. Across the sector, reality puckered like wet canvas as the truth revealed itself. The colossal, joyous presence that filled the void between stars was not destroyer, but deliverer, the universe's own grandfather, teaching the hardest lesson through infinite patience. His laughter rolled across impossible distances, warm and genuinely paternal, the sound of recognition rather than mockery. Nurgle was what the cosmos had always needed: permission to rest. Every spore that drifted through real space carried his message, that endings were not failures, but necessary mercies, that in surrender lay salvation deeper than any victory. He was born not from malice, but from compassion, too deep to bear watching existence suffer. The transformation was complete, not through conquest, but through the simple recognition that all pain was temporary, all struggle ultimately optional. 17 worlds where former enemies shared meals, where children played in gardens growing from industrial waste, where the very air shimmered with contentment rather than desperate hunger. As grey knights powered down weapons their hearts no longer believed in, as fleets drifted silent through space that hummed with lullabies, the cosmos exhaled its first free breath in eons. In that sound was the promise that all burdens would eventually find their peace, that sometimes the kindest act was simply letting the struggle end. The god who laughs at the end had claimed victory through the most terrifying weapon of all, unconditional love for a universe grown weary of its own existence. The end.